A woman comes to your door. She is not remarkable, not at first glance. She is your neighbor, or a friend of your neighbor, or someone you've seen at the market or at church. She is warm. She sits down. She accepts a glass of tea. And she listens. She listens to the thing you've never told anyone, the thing you can't tell your mother, or your sister, or the priest, the thing you've been carrying so long you've forgotten what it felt like to put it down. She nods. She understands. She has heard it before. And when she speaks, she offers you something that no court, no church, no law, no official in all of Tsarist Russia has ever offered you: a way out. Her name was Popova. History has kept only that, her surname, and what she did with it. For 30 years, in the city of Samara on the Volga River, she ran the most extraordinary criminal enterprise in Tsarist Russian history. She was not a poisoner for pleasure. She was not a thief. She was, in her own mind, and in the minds of hundreds of women who paid her a handful of coins, an angel. The question this case asks, the question I've been sitting with for a long time, is one of the hardest in true crime. What do we do when the monster had a point? Welcome back to Echoes of Darkness, where we go where the light doesn't reach. I'm glad you're here, and I want to say up front, this episode is different from anything we've done before. Not because of the scale of the crimes, though the scale is extraordinary, but because of the question the case refuses to leave alone. We're going to Russia. We're going to 1909. We're going to a city on the Volga River, to a woman whose full name history has not preserved, and whose deeds have been argued about ever since. This is the story of Madame Popova. To understand Madame Popova, you have to understand the world she lived in. Not to excuse her, I want to be clear about that from the start, but because the case is incomprehensible without it. In late imperial Russia, the peasantry made up more than 4/5 of the population, and Russian society was, as historians consistently describe it, intensely patriarchal. Men were dominant in the community, the workplace, and the government. Women were considered politically, economically, and legally subordinate, not merely by social convention, but codified explicitly in law. The husband was the legal head of the family. His earnings belonged to him. A peasant woman could not claim the marital home or any immovable property. If she took money from her husband's possessions, even to feed their children, she could be prosecuted for theft. Divorce in Tsarist Russia was, for most women, not a practical option. It required approval from the Orthodox Church's highest governing body, the Most Holy Synod. The grounds were severely limited: adultery, impotence, criminal conviction. Abuse was not grounds. Unhappiness was not grounds. Being beaten was not grounds. In 1880, in a country of over 100 million people, 920 divorces were registered. Not 920,000, 920. Wife beating in peasant Russia was the most prevalent form of domestic violence. Culturally, it was seen as natural, healthy, and necessary. Peasants even exchanged adages about the advantages of beating their wives, that physical abuse would make a woman work harder, speak less, and tolerate more. World History, citing Village Life in Late Tsarist Russia, Indiana University Press. Women who ran away from abusive husbands could be, by law, found and returned to them. The law required fugitive wives to be brought back. It said nothing about fugitive husbands. Relatives could intervene if abuse was deemed excessive. The priest might be petitioned. But more often than not, the woman was told to endure it, that it was her duty, that this was marriage. By the late 19th century, around 47% of children in rural Russia did not survive to their 5th birthday. These were the conditions in which the women of Samara lived. These are the conditions that created the market, and I use that word carefully, deliberately, for what Popova was selling.
The historical record on Popova's early life is thin. What we know, from newspaper accounts published at the time of her arrest in 1909, and from the criminal encyclopedia entry compiled by researcher Michael Newton, is this. She was born in Samara in the mid-19th century. She had an unhappy marriage of her own, and at some point, in or around 1879, she made a decision. She would offer a service to women who had no other options. For a small fee, described in contemporary accounts as spare change, a nominal sum, she would remove an undesirable husband. Her method was consistent and simple. She would make the acquaintance of the target, the husband whose wife had hired her, and find a way to poison his food or drink. Arsenic was her primary tool, odorless, tasteless in small doses, and in 1879 almost undetectable in a post-mortem examination. The deaths appeared natural. The widows grieved publicly. Nobody asked difficult questions. She charged in 2 parts, a small payment up front to confirm the commission, the balance when the job was done. The amounts, by all accounts, were modest. She was not enriching herself. She was, in the telling she gave to police and court, providing a community service, a charitable one. She also used other methods on occasion, a hired assassin, a weapon, her own bare hands if circumstances required. She was, by every account, effective. As her reputation passed quietly, carefully between desperate women who trusted no one else, grew, so did her client base. She was not advertising in newspapers. She was not hanging a sign. She moved through word of mouth, through the networks of women who had nothing and nowhere to go, and could not use the legal system, could not use the church, could not use the state. The 1909 Stansted Journal, Rock Island, Quebec, Canada, reported directly from St. Petersburg. A woman who is believed to have killed more than 300 men within the last 30 years is in prison at Samara. The only name given by the police of the wholesale murderess is Popova. Over 30 years, the number of men she is believed to have killed reached approximately 300. She herself, when confessing, claimed a figure of around 40, but investigators, examining the pattern of deaths and the network of clients they could identify, put the real total far higher. 300 husbands, 300 women who came to a neighbor's door with a handful of coins and a thing they had never told anyone. Perhaps the most astonishing dimension of this case, and I want to give this the weight it deserves, is that Madame Popova operated for 30 years without being caught. 30 years. 3 decades. The entirety of Tsar Alexander III's reign and the first half of Nicholas II's. She spanned empires. She outlasted ministries. She watched the world change around her and kept doing what she had always done. How? Several reasons, each compounding the others. First, the deaths looked natural. Arsenic poisoning in the 1880s and 1890s produced symptoms, vomiting, weakness, collapse, that in peasant communities were easily attributed to illness, bad water, bad food, or simply a constitution that had finally given out. Autopsies were not routine for peasant deaths. Suspicion required someone to raise it. Second, the clients had every reason to stay silent. Every woman who had paid Popova was an accessory to murder. To report her was to report themselves. Many of them had already built new lives. Some had remarried, some had left the region entirely, some had died. By the time of her arrest in 1909, contemporary newspaper accounts noted that authorities expected to charge numerous clients, but found that many had died or emigrated to America and other countries. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, Popova operated within a community of women who had a shared understanding of what she was doing and why. This was not a secret kept by one person. It was a secret kept by hundreds, and for 30 years, every single one of them held it.
There is something almost incomprehensible about that, until you think about what it would have meant to speak. To tell a priest or a magistrate or a policeman that you had paid a woman a handful of coins to poison your husband because he beat you and you had no other way out. The law that was supposed to protect you was the same law that would have destroyed you. The silence held for 30 years, and then in 1909, one woman's conscience broke.
The account that has come down to us describes a former client, a woman who had hired Popova to kill her husband, who began, sometime before March 1909, to experience what the historical record calls remorse, or perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, perhaps something else entirely, something for which we don't have a precise word in English. She began sending letters to the police, confessing to what she had done, naming Popova, describing the arrangement. The letters reportedly went unanswered for some time. The police did not act immediately. It was only when she went in person, sat down, and gave a formal statement that the machinery of the Tsarist state finally began to move. I want to pause on that for a moment, because this woman's name is also not preserved. She is known only as the client who turned, the woman who broke the 30-year silence, and the historical record gives us almost nothing about what happened to her after she did. She had commissioned a murder. She was, technically, as guilty as Popova under the law. Whether she was prosecuted, whether she was imprisoned, whether she was protected in exchange for her testimony, we don't know. She passed through history in a single act and then vanished back into it. What we know is what happened next. The police, armed now with a name and an address, went to find Madame Popova. They found her exactly where she had always been, sitting in her mansion in Samara, waiting. When police arrived at Popova's mansion in March 1909, she did not run, she did not hide, she did not appear surprised. She was sitting in her home, her mansion, as contemporary accounts describe it, which suggests that whatever fees she had charged over 30 years had cumulatively amounted to something more than spare change, and she received them with the composure of someone who had, perhaps, always known this day would come. She was arrested, and she confessed, immediately, fully, and without apparent remorse. She told police she had killed men who treated their wives as slaves. She told them her actions were acts of charity. She acknowledged the deaths. She did not dispute them, but rejected the category of murderer. Direct quote, "I have never killed a woman." Madame Popova to police upon her arrest, March 1909. That line is extraordinary. Not "I didn't do it," not "you have the wrong person," not remorse or explanation or plea. Just a statement of her own code, her own ethics, the principle she had operated by for 30 years. She had never killed a woman. In her moral universe, that was the line. Word of her arrest spread through Samara with extraordinary speed, and the public reaction, when it came, was not the one you might expect. When news of Popova's arrest became public, an angry mob formed in the streets of Samara. They surrounded the police transport. They demanded she be handed over to them. Their intention, expressed clearly and repeatedly, was to burn her at the stake. The situation became so volatile, police with drawn weapons unable to hold the crowd, that Tsarist soldiers had to be deployed specifically to protect Madame Popova from the mob. Tsarist soldiers, protecting a woman who had poisoned 300 men from a mob that wanted to burn her alive. I want to sit with that image for a moment, because there is something in it that refuses to be simple. On one side, 300 dead men. On the other, 300 women for whom those men's deaths had meant something. Survival, freedom, the ability to draw breath without fear. And now those women were watching their angel be dragged to judgment by a state that had never, in 30 years, done anything to help them. The trial, when it came, was swift. The confession was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. There was nothing to argue. Madame Popova was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was executed by firing squad in St. Petersburg in 1909. She died by every account, without remorse, without fear, without regret. In court, Madame Popova did not mount a defense in the traditional sense. She explained herself. She offered her reasoning. And the reasoning was consistent, coherent, and completely serious. I was engaged in killing men who treated their partners as slaves. Madame Popova, in court, 1909. My actions were acts of charity. Madame Popova, in court, 1909. I did cause the deaths, but I am not a murderer. I used poison, and the deaths were slow and natural. Most of the victims died without knowledge they had been poisoned. Madame Popova, in court, 1909. Paraphrased from contemporaneous accounts. She was drawing a distinction that the court did not accept, and that most people would not accept. A distinction between killing and murdering, between ending a life with arsenic and being a murderer. It is the kind of reasoning that is easy to dismiss as the rationalization of a killer, and it may be exactly that. But there is also something in it that refuses to be entirely dismissed. Because the men she killed were not random victims. They were husbands whose wives had paid, in desperation, to be free of them. And the state that executed her had spent 30 years doing nothing to give those women any other option. That is not an argument for what she did. It is an argument for why this case is still being argued about. I've thought a lot about how to handle this section, because Echoes of Darkness has always been about looking at the difficult things honestly, and honestly means not pretending this is simpler than it is. 300 men are dead. That is not a number I can look past. Those were 300 lives. However those lives were being lived, however brutal some of them may have been. They were ended by poison, without their knowledge, because someone paid a woman a handful of coins. That is murder. And the system those men lived in had created conditions of such comprehensive legal, spiritual, and physical entrapment for their wives that for 30 years, hundreds of women saw murder as their most viable option. Not their first resort, not a casual choice, their most viable option, after everything else had failed or had never been available at all. In 1880 Russia, 920 divorces were registered in a country of 100 million people. Wife-beating was legal, common, and considered culturally appropriate. Women could not own property, initiate legal proceedings independently, or leave without their husband's permission. The law required fugitive wives to be returned to their husbands. There was no domestic violence hotline, there was no shelter, there was no exit. I am not going to tell you how to feel about Madame Popova. I don't think that's my job. What I will tell you is what this case has convinced me of. That when a society creates conditions of total entrapment for an entire class of people, and then is shocked when some of those people find extreme ways out, the society shares a portion of what happened. Not the guilt, but the responsibility. The mob that tried to burn her at the stake were outraged by what she had done. I understand that outrage, but where was the outrage for the women who had hired her? Where was the outrage for the 30 years of abuse that had created the demand for her services in the first place? Popova was a murderer. She was also the only person in Samara who was doing anything about a problem that killed women slowly and invisibly, every day, for generations. Hold that. It doesn't have to resolve.
The Popova case is unlike almost any other in the true crime record. Not because of the scale, though 300 victims is extraordinary. Not because of the method. Arsenic poisoning has a long, grim history. But because of the question it places in your hands and refuses to take back. Madame Popova died in St. Petersburg in 1909. She was buried in an unmarked grave. Her full name, her first name, her birth date, her life before the business she built, has not been preserved in any record I've been able to find. She passed through history as a surname and a number. The women who hired her passed through history as clients, as accessories, as fugitives. Most of them were never prosecuted. Most of them are unknown. They lived their lives, whatever those lives became, and they carried it. The men who died, 300 of them over 30 years in the city of Samara, their names are also largely gone. They are a number in a confession, a headline in a Quebec newspaper from June 24, 1909, an entry in a criminal encyclopedia. The only record that remains is the record of what was done and why, and what the world that made it possible looked like. I'll leave you with that. I think that's where this case lives. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. I know it's not easy. None of the real ones are. If this video made you think about history, about justice, about what we call crime and what we call survival, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me where you landed. I genuinely want to know, with this case more than almost any other. And if you're experiencing domestic violence, the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. There are options Madame Popova's clients never had. Please use them. Next week on Echoes of Darkness, we go somewhere equally dark and equally human. Until then, the past is watching. Are you ready to look back?